Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Inney Prakash with Maysles Documentary Center. I'm one of the programmers here, and along with my colleagues Emily Apter and Annie Horner, have curated the series After Civilization, which features speculative documentaries that reckon with ecological crisis and the ongoing material violences of dispossession. We have a full description on our website that we worked, we've talked through very carefully and thoughtfully, but the gist is these are all documentaries that use some kind of either future fictitious framing device or gesture towards the future in order to make some comment on the present and reconcile past injustices with present consciousness. So we're really honored and glad to have here today with us Christina Battle, whose films Bad Stars and Water Once Ruled you can view as part of the program. Zack Khalil, whose film INAATE that he made with his brother Zack. Glad to have you, Zack. G. Anthony Svatek, who made a film called .tv, and Hanna Jayanti, whose Truth or Consequences is available in the program as a special sneak preview. The film premiered at Rotterdam this year and also is a part of Sheffield, which I believe happened digitally and then is happening in a small physical iteration too later this year. Maysles Documentary Center is a 51-seat cinema in Harlem, and it is also an education center. That's normally where we would be. Of course, these aren't normal times. Although we have recently started a sidewalk cinema. Every Friday, you can come by our space and view something projected onto our window. We'll have about 10 seats properly distanced. That's been a way we've been sort of able to dip our toes back into the physical world. But otherwise, we're very glad to still be able to program content. You can see what else is available online. After Civilization will be up until the 16th. And we also have right now, as part of our Under the Influence series, the film A Rockumentary, which was chosen by the documentarian Kalika Law. So with all that said, we'll go ahead and get started. Since we're talking about the future and what we can do by using the future as a tool, I was wondering if I could start with you, Zack, since your film centers largely on an indigenous prophecy. I was wondering if you could talk specifically about that prophecy and what function prophecy serves in indigenous culture.
Totally, great question. Yeah, and for not to say we're talking specifically about my tribe, the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people, and in that film, the Seven Fires prophecy is a specific prophecy I'm invoking. And although it's in English called a prophecy, it kind of straddles this line between telling sort of telling history and predicting the future. It's sort of a prophecy that serves both to educate Anishinaabe people about our past as well as sort of guide us into the future. And sort of in Anishinaabe thinking, it's important to think about any decision, any action about now, one's ancestors 7 generations behind them and 7 generations ahead of them. So prophecy is sort of like the formalized way of doing that. And not to say the prophecy itself, the Seven Fires prophecy, it's really easy to get sort of to think dogmatically about it as if it's one thing, but there's thousands of different versions. It really is something that moves through people more than anything else, the way that and communities and the way that the story is told. But it most basically sort of, in almost all of its framing, it serves to sort of predict the colonization of the Americas and the arrival of the Europeans, and point to a choice that not only Anishinaabe people, but sort of all the people of the world will have in the future to go ultimately between these sort of two ways of life. One, which is the sort of the path of technology, and the other is this path of spiritualism. And that's sort of like a I think, an oversimplification that sort of comes down from the story being passed down so many times, and that's like the most codified version. But at the same time, I think we can all relate to sort of how that choice maybe applies in our present moment today, especially these days.
Christina, sort of going off of that, there's a quote from Bad Stars. You say myths, stories, and traditional knowledge can sometimes tell our contemporary communities and researchers, alert them to previously unheeded geohazards, helping to reinforce dangers that might arise. So you use a lot of technological data in telling your stories, satellite images and images from Google Earth, but also point to the failings of these technologies to tell us certain things. So I was wondering if you could talk about what you see, the strengths you see in myths and stories, and what specifically your intent is with incorporating those images.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in thinking about technology and how it's reflecting the world back to us for ourselves, and the sort of disconnects, well, the overlaps and the disconnects with how that might match up with things we already sort of know. I mean, I guess you might think of it in terms of like a common sense, but in the ways that storytelling over generations, in myth making, you know, all of those strategies that we use and we lean on and have for many, many years to remind ourselves of hazards, of disasters, of things to do and not to do to keep ourselves safe. And then how the technology, which might be showing us what the world looks like, or even monitoring, you know, air quality, monitoring the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, but might be missing the point about all of the other complexities that are also related to such things. So yes, it's important to know how much carbon dioxide is in the air, but what does it also mean to know about how close it is that we live among those industries that are pumping all of that out into the air? And those sort of like common knowledge things that get lost in contemporary society, at least in contemporary Western society, where we know that certain communities are sort of deliberately near some of the industries that are causing more problems, and the things that we sort of ignore, and the implications of that.
Right, especially regards to Canada and your film's Indigenous communities, your highly toxic sites.
Yeah, and the locations of where these industries are situated isn't by chance, right? It's by design. And often I think a lot of that is neglected to be discussed, at least in this country, probably in most. And so what does it mean when we sort of know that certain amounts of carbon dioxide in the air, as an example, are problematic for us as a greater collective or greater community, but we neglect to talk about the fact that certain communities are actually more at risk of thinking with those things. And the technology doesn't incorporate that sort of measurement in the way that it repeats back or reflects back these levels to us collectively.
Anthony, your film .tv points out the sort of absurd and vile irony of the fact that the .tv domain extension has become considered more valuable than the island and the people itself. And you used exclusively found footage from YouTube to tell this story. I'm sure that was cheaper than flying, but also can you explain the intent behind that and how you sort of use that to comment on the way that cyberspace has superseded actual physical space in this instance?
Sure, great question. Well, I mean, yeah, using found footage is cheaper than flying thousands of miles in many different ways. But I basically, I wanted to be very honest about the perspective from which the film was told, which was from a very distant, far away, mediated place. And so, and I had never traveled to Tuvalu. I had never heard about Tuvalu until I read about .tv, and then all these things started coming together. And I was learning about Tuvalu, about what it looked like, by just like searching the internet, right? And that to me like felt like that needed to be part of the process and part of the project as well. And And so I felt like using found footage made sense simply because I was being resourceful about the perspective from which it was told, which was this distant gaze with which many people who live in cities who might believe in climate change or care about environmental issues and climate justice and whatnot, they believe in that, but it still feels quite separate from many of these people's lives, and that technology and mediated image from distant faraway places, and which is parallel to this like distant faraway threat that people still think of when they think of the climate crisis. I felt like it needed that kind of parallel in the storytelling and the material that I was using.
Totally. Hanna, your film Truth or Consequences tells the extraordinary story of this town that was named after a game show and boasts the first commercial spaceport. Can you talk about how you discovered this town, its story, and then what led to the decision to create a speculative documentary, one that suggests that this is a world where the spaceport is active and functioning?
Yeah, you have to be careful. Sometimes I tell a whole long story about it, so you should keep me in check about it. I also just want to thank you, Inney, and also Maysles Cinema for doing this. I feel really grateful to be in conversation with the other filmmakers here. It was really wonderful to listen to what are clearly like very thoughtful and nuanced ways of making films, especially in the documentary realm, which I think is really important right now. This is not responding to your question, but one of the things I've just been thinking a lot about lately is like formally challenging work as ethical and political. And I think that often we think about it as aesthetic choices, or we call it like experimental. And I've just been thinking a lot about what it looks like to break traditional narratives and why that is an actually impactful process, both in the making of and in the final product. So I guess maybe that leads me into answering your question, which is personally, I don't know if the story about like how I found the town is that interesting. But I fell in love with it, and I spent a lot of time there. And I was quite moved by what Anthony was saying around point of view and this idea of like being honest to the perspective. I think I want to be careful not being like critical of the documentaries, but I think that there is more room for being thoughtful about the perspective that films are made from. And I think one thing that can happen, like, okay, so I went to a town that I'm not from. Okay, I'm not from Truth or Consequences. I spent a lot of time in New Mexico, but like I can't claim to be a resident there or to like be able to represent what the place is. And so, there's one kind of version, which is that I make this film about the small town and sort of claim that this is the truth of the town and what they're dealing with and who they are and what they care about. And a lot of sort of more traditional documentary narratives encourage that, I would say. And so I think a lot of it came about, the speculative premise for me was very process oriented. I actually made a completely different cut of the film about 3.5 years into making the film. The film took me 5 years. I like to spend a long time making things. But around 3.5 years in, I made a cut that was, I think it was good. I think it was fine. It was like poetic and kind. I don't know, but I hated it. And it was not speculative. It was much more traditional. It was like, here's a town, and look next door, there is this crazy spaceport for rich people. And look at this town people don't make very much money. And look at the economic problems that creates. And let's like build these character arcs where people are in relationship to if this thing is going to help them or not, And I feel like I had such good intentions, and I still made a film that was like really not what I was trying to make. And I remember watching it at a retreat that I was at and just being like, oh shit, sorry, I don't know if we're allowed to say that on this. Oh shoot, I did the thing. One thing I thought a lot about, this sort of goes back to the question of narrative as ethical and political, is that I felt that there's this interesting thing that I had done, which I think is actually quite common, which is that you find an external circumstance. People are in an external circumstance, and then you give that thing all the power, actually. So they are responding to something, and their entire lives, their entire character trajectories are built around this thing outside of them, in the case of my film, The Spaceport. And I just watched how like their stories and the things they cared about got kind of reduced and squished into just responding to this thing. And and it meant, you know, like in the edit, I was like, oh, well, I have to leave out that because that doesn't relate to the storyline or this, or somebody was like, that scene doesn't make sense because you know, and I was just like, oh no, I'm cutting out all the things that matter. And so the simplest thing was that I started thinking, what if the spaceport had just happened? What if I just took out that narrative impulse? That's like, here's a thing that might happen. What kind of questions would it start asking? And the kind of questions it started asking, instead of like, will the spaceport economically affect people? We're like, what do these people care about? What are the worlds that they're building? What is meaningful to them? How are they intertwining their past with the present and the possible future? What do they look like as people that we could really potentially listen to in new ways? And I think that I was really amazed both by how hard it is to actually break traditional formats in documentary, and also, I don't know, just the experience of opening up new questions through form, which is something that I think I'm becoming more and more passionate about.
Thank you. Yeah, so I really appreciate you saying, talking about, you know, the ethical kind of going beyond the aesthetic, because although, you know, at the beginning here, we had an idea about a certain aesthetic tool, the bigger question was, how can you use that tool to tell important stories, right? And we're absolutely, we're absolutely pro-critiquing documentary as a form here. At least once a day, I feel that documentaries are unethical as a genre and should not exist. Zack, I know that you're someone who's engaged a lot with the question of documentary ethics, and you know, through your work with various collectives and attending the Flaherty. There was a moment in INAATE that really strikes me every time I see it, which is when during the vision, a young woman uses a gun to shoot this sort of caricature of a white colonizing priest. And it was interesting for me to think about how the gun is a weapon that these colonizers brought with them, and using that to destroy them, and then also using the camera, something that has been used in extremely, extremely undermining colonial ways, using that to turn it around on the people who've used it to exploit. Is that something you think a lot about, and how does it manifest in the way you work?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I think that particular scene is really inspired by that train of thought, which, like, in some of my research is really inspired by the video artist, filmmaker Juan Downey, who made a video called The Laughing Alligator, I believe in the 70s, where he was sort of documenting his experience with the Yanomami, a sort of less discovered tribe in the Amazon that was in a lot of other documentaries in the 70s as well, a lot more straightforward, objective style. But his documentary was about taking his family to go live there, and he was a Chilean and sort of self-identified as maybe feeling like one of them in some ways, even though he also wasn't, and just had a really critical take on documentary and visual ethnography that function somewhat more as call in as opposed to sort of acknowledging this desire for indigeneity within himself, the create film. But there's a particular scene where he's walking in the woods with two Yanomami men who are hunters, and he's walking with this camera and he narrates it, and just like he's playing the camera at the other guy, and they kind of have this standoff for a moment, and this sort of meditation reflection on the camera also is a weapon. The camera also is in some ways, and the camera is capable of doing violence for in questioning sort of the ethics of the medium itself, and really trying to probe its origins, especially as an indigenous person, thinking about what the roots of documentary are in the moving image, even going back to like concepts and recording Sioux Indians dancing images, even. And then like the Nick of the North often being cited as one of like the first documentaries. It's kind of like, you know, in our terms today, we think of it as like a piece of branded content for so I think it's like interesting to when you look at the history of documenting and moving image, there are always indigenous people sort of in the center of the frame from the beginning, but it's often, you know, not actually having the tools or the power to actually affect. There's a great awareness amongst a lot of different indigenous populations, including my Anishinaabe community back home, around cameras, around documentary, and their association with visual anthropology and sort of extractive impulse, you know, extracting knowledge, extracting images, kind of in line with the resources and some of these other films address. And so I think inherently, and I think that documentary form, you know, conventional documentary form, really is inherently violent, and like it really has to be questioned and justified and changed. And the objectivity that it sort of purports to as a baseline for conversation amongst cultures is really obviously like really problematic. And I think that sort of claim to reality. So a big focus for my filmmaking, I think a lot of these films is like an emphasis on subjectivity, and not as any sort of weakness, but like as a way for actually delving deeper into subjects and holding paradoxes and complexities together.
Great answer. Anthony, you have met, oh, I should say also, we'll take questions from people. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A box or the chat. But in the meantime, Anthony, you've said you approached Tuvalu as an outsider, but certainly with a, you know, you weren't purporting to speak for anybody, and you did so, it seems, with the collaboration with the narrator speaks in the language. Can you talk about the nature of that collaboration and how you approached it?
Sure. Well, the whole like voicemail from the future idea came about because I knew there was a way in which those facts that are stated as text on screen needed to be more digested in the film, and needed to have a voice in there that I felt was hopefully a little bit more just human, relatable, some kind of warmth that was missing from just the text and just like the cold hard research that I had done. And so these are some thoughts that I had. Like I was trying to sort of synthesize the connections between .tv as domain name, and then Tuvalu and the country disappearing, and all the thoughts and feelings that were sort of happening between those two facts I had written down and thought about, but I couldn't yet really formulate them in the way that they made sense in the project. So then I was trying to find people from Tuvalu, and it was in New York first, and as far as I was able to do my research, I wasn't able to find anyone who was from Tuvalu specifically, because there's only, I think it's, the population is about 10,000 people altogether who hold a citizenship at least. And then somehow through Facebook and all different other sorts of connections, I found a Tuvaluan expat community in New Zealand, and I connected with a voice artist there who was about probably 18 at the time, and he had also never been to Tuvalu, but he very much identified with the culture and with the country, and he knew what was going on as well. He knew the reality of Tuvalu sinking, but he had also never been there. And so we started just having a conversation about both of us thinking about this narrative. For him, his way to relate to that narrative was obviously through his ancestry and his culture and everything. And for me, it was from this tech perspective, from this like domain tech perspective. That was a very sort of techno-urbanized way to relate to this thing that I felt like has become second nature to me, and is something that is almost more relatable than the natural physical environment. And so from those two perspectives, we were writing each other and starting a conversation, seeing, okay, what are some of the thoughts and ideas that would come together if we had these two opposite poles that are part of the same connection and part of the same narrative. And then from those conversations, that's where the script came about, and the story idea, the narration came about, and then eventually he voiced it and brought it into the project that way. And we felt it needed. We felt also the idea to set it in the future was also to, in a way, trick is not really the right word, but we both felt like it needed to have a fictionalized element in it, because it was such a unreal story in a way, and such a hard to believe story, that it would be easier for audiences to understand it and follow it if they knew that there was a fictional element in it. So it was a tool, like an instrument, I think, the fictional element of that, but the sentiments and the thoughts were very real.
That's really interesting, that sort of pragmatic use of the fiction element, and that makes sense. It is a wild, hard thing to believe. Christina, you use text in conjunction with narration too, and it creates a really interesting dialectic in your work. Can you talk about how that functions for you?
Sure, yeah. I think, and maybe just to take a step back for a second, I've really appreciated this conversation so far, because I have never thought of my work as being documentary, actually. Although recently I've been realizing this is a really appropriate way to sort of categorize it. In a way useful, because documentary, at least in a sense, is known. People sort of understand what you mean when you say documentary, although of course, I think we're all a bit more invested in thinking about the nuance and the form itself than maybe like in popular culture. But I had this moment where I realized that leaning on documentary actually is kind of fraught as well. So it's sort of an easy way to explain to someone coming to my work who maybe isn't as familiar with moving image arts practice or experimental cinema, or however you want to contextualize it. But then it sort of puts me into this other category that I also don't quite fit into. So I really appreciated something that Hanna was saying about like this need perhaps for us to really challenge this form as something that's really important, at least in the sort of popular culture sense, right? Why is it that people, when they think of documentary, think of a particular thing, and perhaps it could very easily be quite different. And yeah, so in a way, I think I sort of use different forms like text, narration, images, a lot of appropriated imagery as well, with which I relate to what Anthony was talking about a lot with that. Because I kind of just like throw a bunch of stuff together. And all of it is coming through research. And so I sort of think about it as a way to visualize research. And then I'm really invested in storytelling and narrative and, you know, what's the way to reveal certain bits of information. Some things work really well told through voice, some through text. But ultimately, I think it really gives me a chance to stack a whole bunch of things together into a really short period of time. Especially with some of these more recent works, when I am really interested in thinking about, especially satellite technology, you know, what does it mean for these satellites to be sort of roving around above us at all times, and the perspective that they have from an aerial perspective of looking down on the world, and how that sort of flattens our perspective, and then how the fact that we're relying on that imagery to tell us something about a place that we've maybe never been, which is awesome. Like, I love being able to look at imagery of Mars. I'm glad that that exists, but how does that aerial perspective sort of shift my then sort of ideas of how Mars might be and my relationship to it? So for me, I think having all of these different forms all together at the same time or sort of in conjunction with one another lets me think about that sort of flattening of perspective in a way.
Totally, yeah. I love the way you're able to use the fascination that those forms create in order to interrogate them. Is there a specific distinction between what gets written and what gets spoken, or is it?
Yeah. So I think it sort of depends, maybe work to work, but in the Bad Stars Chemical Valley piece, there's a lot of sort of scientific data and language that comes from engineers talking about how it is that Google Earth generates its images, or how it is that satellites photograph the Earth. So in those cases, I always sort of feel like having a somewhat human voice, because sometimes I rely on technology to sort of stimulate or simulate human voice. That's really important to me, so that it feels like it's grounded within something that maybe is more storytelling as opposed to just scientific information. But it sort of depends. It really depends on also what I'm comfortable with having my own voice saying to a group of other individuals or audience members. Because I think for me, like being able to, if I'm using my voice in terms of narration, I want to be able to sort of stand behind what it is that I'm saying and make sure that it has some sort of relationship to the personal at the same time as sort of separating the personal and classifying scientific data. So it sort of depends, and it's a weird balance that I flip-flop like every 5 minutes when I'm making a work. So there are many versions where certain text is my voice, and sometimes it's not, sometimes it's the computer voice. And then after I sort of work with something overall, something sort of settles and sits.
Awesome. Yeah, it feels intuitively like it makes sense. So that makes sense to hear. Yeah.
So I'm not sure I always feel that way. So thank you.
As a viewer, it feels that way. Me. Hanna, how did you approach your subjects? You said you didn't have the speculative framing in mind when you started shooting originally. So what is the nature of how much are they in on your creative process?
It's a good question. First of all, it's really nice to talk about film right now. Just having that experience. And I just want to quickly echo two things. Zack, your conversation around like the violence of like a faux objectivity and the embracing of like subjectivity as a strength, I thought was really well phrased. And Christina, I was thinking about one thing that my partner was talking about was the idea that like traditional documentaries, it's more like it's just a genre. it's like a type of documentary, you know, and it's just somehow become the one that is equivalent with what it is. So that it brings me joy to think about that it's just one genre that seems to be very dominant. So now back to the question, which I'm going to try to remember.
And feel free to talk about whatever you're interested in. So it's just a prompt. But it was about, you know, how you approach your subjects and to what extent they're part of your creative process. Because you seem to get very close to them and they share some really intimate things.
So they weren't part of, so everything in the film just happened. There's no like, no one was told to say anything, or, you know, because I had no idea. I just filming with people, you know. I also work in like a very intuitive way. So I just spent like a ton of time in the town and I just filmed things. And you know, the people in the film are the people that I fell in love with. They're the people that I wanted to spend time with. The only intention that I went in with making this film was to actually not have an idea in the beginning. Actually, for me, I'm very wary of having a set idea of what I want to do. I also, like, I don't prep for, if I do an interview, I don't prep for them, because for me, it just overtakes my brain. Like, it actually really gets in the way of listening for me, because I'll just be trying to like get them to say the thing I want, or like something. It's like, why would I think that what exists in my brain has any relationship to what this person is saying? And so I'm like a big believer in being unprepared in certain ways. I think I'm not totally unprepared. Like, I have my camera and it's working, and, you know, but in the sense of like trying to empty my mind, or really trying to be with what they're saying. I think in some ways it's a little bit closer to like an oral history practice, which is, you know, I'm not an oral historian, so I will probably botch oral history practice right now, but my understanding of it is that you create a space for someone to talk about what's important to them, and you listen, and then you ask questions that are building upon what they're saying. And it flows and it goes, you know, they very much take you where they want to go, and you're kind of like the conduit to allow that to happen. And there's things about that. I mean, it becomes a very collaborative process. It becomes a beautiful process where the person feels like they're choosing what they want to share or not. And I, you know, I mean, you would have to ask the people in the film. So, but I hope, this is my, you know, idealized version, is that they felt really communicated with. You know, we would check in a lot. Like with George, I spent a lot. No one in the film, you wouldn't necessarily know their names, but George is the collector, and you know, we would always be. I'd be like, "How's it going?" You know, and you just check in a bunch, and then you just say like, "What do you want to do? You want to do this? You want to do," you know? And then he'd be like, "Well, I want to go to the dump right now," and it's like, "Okay, we're going to the dump," you know. And I think there's something, again, like back to the choice of form. It would be very hard to be able to keep in those moments that were really just things they wanted to show us within a traditional narrative. They don't build, they don't give a key piece of information that then comes later. You know, it just doesn't work that way. And to be honest, my experience of life is it doesn't work that way. Right. My life isn't like that at all. You know, so I think that I was very much trying to capture that texture and be guided by them. I will tell one quick anecdote, which is that when I decided to recut the film, I rewatched all of the footage, which I shot about 150 hours, and I went back, and because usually when you edit, you have all this footage, and then you make selects, and then you edit from the selects. And you've usually made those selects pretty early in the process. So you've already done some kind of filter, and then you start working from that. And so, but often you've made these selects at a time when you don't know, or you're trying to make sense of the madness. You know, you don't know what you're doing, and you're trying to figure it out. And so going going back, I had this just really profound experience of being like, wow, I missed, like, I wasn't listening a lot of the time. You know, I thought I was doing a good job, but like, I saw parts where people were really trying to tell me something, and I had edited a version that was something in my brain and not what they were saying. And so the speculative premise allowed me to create the scenes that were based on a much closer understanding of what they were actually trying to tell me at that moment. Again, from my perspective, like, I'm not trying to claim that I know that, but it was definitely closer than the other edits.
I admire that you allowed the form, the shell, to be dictated by a need to be truthful to the content and the characters. I think that shows and is what makes it more than a gimmick, and not at all a gimmick. And the way you described working with them is also, I think, a great way to be conscious always of the violence that camera is capable of inflicting. There's a question from Adam Hyman for Anthony. Were you or are you now familiar with the film The Disappearance of INAATE by Pauline Huillier?
Nope, not familiar, but
if not, never mind.
Hopefully I can get that in writing. Okay.
He says. And others, feel free also to jump in with questions. And if you have questions for each other, feel free to jump in too. I by no means am trying to co-opt things here. But it does feel really good to be able to discuss these things. And I appreciate, Hanna, too, that you went into process because I think that's something that gets missed a lot and mystified, is the technical process of making a film, which actually is very much a part of the content and a part of the intent and the message. Zack, do you want to talk a little bit about your methods, and especially I'm curious how your methods have changed from working alone or with your brother to now it seems like you're doing a lot of work with larger groups of people, with Cousin and with New Red Order.
Yeah, it's been a big shift, and very different projects too, I guess. Whereas like INAATE is me and my brother sort of trying to rethink like cinematic documentary form in the context of our tribe and our way of telling stories. And then our sort of new project that we're working on, which is a public secret society where we're currently recruiting, called the New Red Order, is more about investigating the desire for indigeneity that's sort of at the heart of America and its myths and political foundations. For the New Red Order, we're kind of making like recruitment videos. So we're doing like testimonials, some of which are more real than others, some of which come from really real conversations, some of which come from actors. So that's been a different process that even kind of further blurs the boundaries. And yeah, I think I also kind of, in line with what Christina was saying, like I never really thought about INAATE as a documentary per se, and was trying to always really just think about it as a film and not get too caught up in those distinctions between sort of like experimental film, art film, narrative film, documentary film, and trying to not let those distinctions really guide the aesthetic decisions. And in terms of the production process and how that's changed from INAATE to the New Red Order, INAATE was very, because it was so much focused on sort of trying to think about a sort of Anishinaabe way of knowing and way of exploring a concept, and telling a story from my own community, was really focused on kind of countering this extractive impulse. So like where, you know, typically if you're making a documentary the right way and spending the budget appropriately, you're doing interviews that are kind of as short as possible. You have a solid idea of what you want from the interviewee before you even go there. And you're really just kind of trying to pull sound bites from them, basically, which is not the best way to let someone maybe truly speak their mind, or to actually really have a conversation, right? It's all about sort of knowing what you want and going out to get it as quickly as possible. And I've worked a lot professionally as like a producer and editor, and that's definitely, you know, the way things go in that world. I can see why from a practical standpoint, but I think it does really prevent a lot of depth from happening and anything unexpected from happening. And it's like if you already know what you want before you go out and get it, it's not that interesting of a project, I feel like, in the first place. If you already know what you're going to get, you know? So not to say it was very much more about spending time with people and visiting with people. Thankfully, we had like the frame of the 7 Fires prophecies, you know, helpful to have some kind of structure in terms of preparedness, something to ask questions about. But the 7 Fires prophecy for my tribe is literally about, you know, there's like 700 years of time. So it's about everything, if you want it to be. And so when you ask somebody to tell you about what they think about the 7 Fires prophecy or specific parts of it, they'll tell you what they're really interested in and what really speaks to them and what really resonates from them in their life. So the production process was a lot of really, really long interviews, like maybe 30 or 40 interviews that averaged around like 3 hours. Because a lot of it was friends and family and sometimes not. And it was just a process of like, especially in my community, there's just a process of visiting. It's like a rural, kind of cold, remote place, and people visit, we hang out, and we talk. We talk for 4 hours. And when you get to know someone, you jokingly not to say when we like ask for someone's introduction, which like on a commercial shoot would be like their name and their title. It's the same when we're shooting, not to say you ask for someone's introduction and like you get their life story, and like an hour and a half later, then you can start to ask questions. And whatever questions you wrote are kind of not applicable anymore because you know so much more about the person. So it's much more about like an open process and giving space and time for people to breathe and to guide the process along and not over-determining it. And the New Red Order is very different. Some of it is that, half of it is that, doing that with people, giving people space and time to talk. And the other half, instead of sort of trying to coax sound bites out of people, we're just hiring actors or just telling people to say specific things, and sort of really doing one or the other very explicitly. And I think that's something really important about documentary in general, is that documentary is really exploitative. And I think there just needs to be an honesty about that. You know, I think to a certain extent it's unavoidable, but it's just about being transparent about that.
Yeah, I think that transparency is really important as well. I love how the openness you talk about totally echoes as well what Hanna talked about with regards to her process. And I should say that I appreciate everyone's skepticism of documentary as a form and as a genre generally. As a programmer, as a curator, you know, I'm only invested in documentary as a firm genre or form to the extent that it allows me to get paid. You know, because so much of the industry has come up along these lines. And then it's on your resume and then so forth. And so a lot of what's interesting to me is seeing how far those boundaries can be pushed. And I think for my colleagues as well.
A quick thing to that, and maybe I'm just reiterating something I've already said, but I think what was so fascinating to me is that I had to do something seemingly radical or seemingly whatever to get back at just the basic tenets of documentary filmmaking, which is like listening and bearing witness, and you know what I mean? Like, and maybe that's not the basic tenets because it comes from this long history that is deeply complicated and deeply based in like anthropology and extraction and colonialism. So maybe actually it makes sense that we're recreating it, but at least the things that we stand for. Yeah, I was just amazed that the only way that I felt like I could get towards that was to do something non-traditional, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. In order for something to get back to basics again, you have to get out of the rhythm.
And maybe that's not the case. You know, maybe that's not the case for everybody. I would just speak personally for myself. Like another experience. I would be really curious for all of you. It sounds to learn about. Like for me, working on traditions. I hate these terms, but I don't know what else to say. But because it's always like against something else, you know. But it was like one of the things I learned about making this film was how deeply I've internalized certain things. That there was like a navigation in myself around it, like a constant pull around how I thought things should be, and then the kind of creative navigation I had to do something different. I really would be curious if anyone else has that experience, or or another version of it or something.
I mean, yeah, Zach here, I can relate to that in terms of the sort of barometer for when something feels right is because of so much of what is seen is typical documentary, sort of more traditional. It's hard to escape that sense. It's sort of, for me, I notice it often comes from a sort of like imposter syndrome place. Like, I don't even know if I have a movie here until it feels like a movie, you know? And oftentimes, yeah, that references traditional documentary. That's problematic. I think I just try to watch more things that don't make me feel that way. So I can have a moment that feels like something that I haven't seen before, and I can like trust that, you know? And sometimes when it feels like a documentary that feels comforting, sometimes I try to question that too. And it seems like you do too, which is great.
I'm just thinking a lot about how I feel like I play it pretty loose with like fact and fiction, actually, a lot. And my comfort level within that often is a bit challenged, and especially within the framing of how a work, the structure of a work, sort of maybe leads toward a particular reading of, you know, something being quite informative and factual and truthful. Not to say that the things in my work are not true, but because I collage things together in certain ways and sort of insert my own voice, often I think there's like, it's pretty blurry. So sometimes I feel a bit of discomfort around that, and sort of wanting to check, you know, maybe formally, I might introduce strategies that somehow in my mind make it clear that it's not necessarily like a scientific factual thing, but actually coming from my own perspective. But that is definitely something that push and pull for me when I'm working on things as well.
We have a couple questions from audience members. It is a few minutes to 8, and I just want to respect everyone's time. Does anybody need to go hard at 8 o'clock? Great. So someone asked, Zach brought up extractive processes in his earlier response about the violent history of ethnography making and documentary. This is a question for everyone, however, anyone, if applicable, can you all speak a bit about this idea of extraction? Hanna, you mentioned it as well, of resources, culture, value, labor, data in your films.
I'll give everybody else a chance to address, but I'm happy to start. Yeah, I don't want to reiterate what I said too much, but that's really the basis of the medium. So much is that extractive impulse, and that's something that has to be acknowledged when you decide to make a documentary, and when you talk to people and you ask them to participate. And I think there's a lot of hesitancy around participation, specifically from communities that have been negatively affected by that kind of extraction. And that hesitancy is very justified and legitimate, but I think it can also serve as a roadblock to communicating to a broader public the specificities of our communities and our cultures in a way that ultimately can sort of like advocate against that extractive impulse. So I think it's a really important thing to question and engage with and speak critically about, and with people that you're making movies for and with and about. But ultimately, I think it's something to acknowledge and move through as part of the process, and to try to, in the end, like to try to make it more reciprocal, a more reciprocal sort of extraction, a two-way street, and one way or another. There's a lot of different ways that could happen.
Yeah, I had thought, I mean, it's a really important question, and it is something that should always be at the forefront of filmmakers, nonfiction filmmakers' minds, I think. When I think the way I feel like I think about that in relation to .tv was the way I used that found footage film of Tuvalu was, it seemed to me it was more the scraps of like an extractivist action that had already taken place, where so there's this guy, the way I got that footage was there's this globe-trotting French guy who travels all around the world and films stuff and doesn't edit it really, but just like uploads it to his YouTube channel, and it's just like hours of just shots of random things that he found, and but there's no rhyme or reason really to it, and nobody had really watched it. There's been like maybe like 20 views on like a 5-minute like string out of clips or something on there, and I felt like there's such a plethora of that sort of material just like sitting around everywhere, especially online, and like if we think about the internet as an archive and as something that is just online, and we put these things up online and material, whatever it might be, and don't ever really think about, okay, what is being done to this material and what can be made from this material and how can it be remade and recontextualized, and that excites me a lot, is like to think about what is the damage that's already done potentially, what are the things that already exist, what is the material that already exists that are part of extractivist processes or damaging processes or I don't know, undeliberated processes, and how can we use those in a way to not make them go to waste, which I felt like a little bit what was happening to some of those clips. I think YouTube is an endless, just like, I mean, it's such a like vortex of just material that you can just like endlessly click and keep going, and eventually you end up watching clips that, you know, nobody had like 1 view or 2 views or something, but it's amazing material, and it's like, what, how does it just lie around here really? Like, this is such a waste, and there's so many possibilities there. And I feel like a lot of these like ideas of like, ooh, I have to create my own material, and I have to like do this thing where I have to go to a place and tell an original story, as much as I respect that and love doing that too. But I'm really interested in like, what is some material that already exists? What are some of the scraps that are lying around, and how can they be used and collected in a way and put together in a way that gives them new meaning? And there's a slew of problematics with that too, of course, but that's what I very much enjoyed about working on .tv with, is like using this like found footage in that sort of way, and thinking about it as like not a recycling process really. That's not the right word, but I don't know, just it was more gentle than just this recycled sort of picture that I'm having in my mind right now.
I think that's a really compelling argument for using found footage. Sarah in the audience asks, I'm curious to hear more about how you each understand your relationship to time in your respective films. How do you construct or newly envision what time means or could mean in your work, especially given the colonial/capitalist history of constructing standardized notions of time?
Maybe I'll jump in. And I feel like I'm like trying to work it out in my mind as I'm about to even say it. But I think, so a lot of my work is really interested in imagining some sort of future, but a future that doesn't necessarily follow from the path that we're on right now. and I'm really interested also in thinking about how the past has led us to this path that we're on right now, and then somehow flattening and superimposing all those things onto one another at once. So thinking about how like the things that we're experiencing in the world right now, you know, they all come from certain histories and legacies. There's no denying that. It is a part of everything that we do and everything that we're experiencing all the time, and could lead towards some particular future, but I'm trying to like kind of shift what that future is, and then try to think about how the past, you know, if perhaps we existed on some other timeline, might have led towards some other future, and how thinking about the present right now might disrupt that path to lead towards something else, which I'm not sure if that's even legible, what I'm saying, but maybe just to differentiate this sense of thinking about the future, like from the way that the world operates right now. Because I think there are so many other potentials that we sort of lose sight of and don't ever allow ourselves to imagine. In the same way that we were talking about documentary as a genre as being the one that everyone sort of understands, like didn't really have to be that way, although we know why it is that way. But just trying to imagine these other potentials from other things that have happened in the past that could have been.
That's great. I think that makes a lot of sense.
I unmuted myself without knowing what I was going to say. Christina, your response is so amazing. Also, this question is so good. I think I would just say more broadly, building off what Christina said, that there's something about I don't know what I'm going to say exactly, but here goes. There's something about like the generative possibilities of documentary. Like we think about documentaries as something that is either in the present or in the past, right? And that makes sense because we think about it as based on footage that is like a document. And there's something about the ability to create new spaces, like to actually have it be generative, to lead to senses of possibilities where there aren't, right? To question, oh, did this have to be this way? But in a way that is about creating a kind of re-envisioning. That I think is, I don't know what else to say about that, except it's just, I think it's really powerful and it's a really interesting idea. And there's something really interesting about doing that with nonfiction footage in particular. And I don't know how to respond in my film in terms of the history of colonial capitalist relationships around time. But I'll say for me, something I think about is I think about just this idea that we live in a world where we think time is linear, but it's like the past is done and the present is now and the future isn't. And I think it's way more complex. Like the past erupts into the present all the time. The future erupts into the present all the time. And we're often like just literally bumping into both of those. You know, through like an object in our house that holds something, through a sense of something that we thought would happen that doesn't happen. And so there's something about how it's really alive. And then I'd also just add there's a lot of the past that we haven't listened to, that we've deprioritized. There's a lot of the past that has been, you know, one sort of undercurrent of Truth or Consequences is that there are histories and presents and futures that are built on things that don't speak about a lot of the things that they're built on. So one very subtle example in the film is like the mining industry. There's sort of this sense of sort of beautiful gems that come out of a really violent excavation of the earth and exploitation of people and the land and animals. And so, yeah, I don't know, what would it look like if we carried that in a different way, not as something that has happened, but as something that is continually erupting.
Those are both such great answers to a wonderful question. I think when creating the program, it's something we thought a lot about, and there's, my mind goes back right now to, there's a fantastic essay, I'm forgetting the title of, on Afrofuturism by Kodwo Eshun, who's a scholar and filmmaker that appears in The Last Angel of History. And he talks about the importance of doing future work to get ahead of the colonialists, the capitalists, and how they're already doing this future work, you know, through the market and through speculation. And so part of us, you know, not getting stuck just in the present is you know, fighting back, fighting for the future, so that it can perhaps be a little less destructive than the past, since those forces are still at work. This is an important question, I think, too. Fiona asks, I'd love to hear the filmmakers speak about how they think about creating formally challenging work while also keeping their viewers engaged. Are there challenges to getting formally challenging work seen outside of film literate circles?
Yes. Oh, I just spoke a lot, but yes, there are challenges. I'd be really curious to hear what other people's experiences are.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer exactly, except just to echo, yeah, it is tricky. And maybe so what Anthony was talking about with like YouTube, pulling from YouTube videos, pulling footage from YouTube videos, I feel like, and I don't know if I really believe this or not, but maybe online is a way to sort of allow for different forms and strategies to be taken up, and maybe there's something good about that. I mean, often I think there's things that are really not good about that. But I feel like anecdotally people now have, this is such a weird generalization, but I do have a sense that people have sort of a wider visual literacy now than pre-internet. And maybe somewhere within that is this answer to the question of how maybe those challenges don't need to be as difficult. Yeah. And maybe even thinking about it in terms of exhibition, like, because, you know, I sort of live somewhere that is very much not the center of like art, film, conversations. But because everything has been thrown online of late, I've really valued being able to take part in conversations like this, to be able to be introduced to work that's happening all around the world. So just that sort of rethinking about how distance operates, or how distance might actually allow for bringing people together and having other connections, I think is also somehow related to that question. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
Yeah, I feel like so much of it is access to, and knowledge to spaces, knowledge to, like physical spaces, and like whether it's micro cinemas, or galleries or theaters, whatever it might be. But then actually I was going to have a question for the programming team, which was, I'm curious, like if this like new world order and infrastructure in which we operate now, like if that actually is opening up avenues and ways for people to access this type of work, and to find it simply because it is, I'm using this term a second time now in this conversation, but because it is second nature, because this is how we access and consume images now. Primarily it's from our screens, it's from home, it isn't necessarily in a physical space so much anymore. So I'm wondering if this new form of viewing together apart could potentially open up new like ways in which new audiences can come in and have access to this work. I hope so, and I think so. I agree with Christina that like people are opening up to this. People are getting sick and tired of like Netflix docs and like all that shit. Like people are getting really bored with that stuff, and I think people want to see things they haven't seen before, really, but they still want to use the same tools to see that. So something like this, I think, comes quite naturally.
I think, Inney, that was a question for you, so I don't want to step over that, but can I share a little? So I got an email from somebody who watched the film as part of a festival. Can I just share like a couple sentences from it? Because it's very much what we're speaking about. And I was just so moved about it. And I feel, you know, I think there's a lot of questions about the ritual space, but I love this idea that there is a sort of an opening of it. But she started by saying, see, maybe you would think I'm one of the people or somehow like the people in your film. Never in a million years would I have got to see this film if it wasn't for COVID. And then at the end she said, maybe one thing from COVID could be that people found something out about being human, staying in place, how hard it was to miss each other, how extending it was to be with just those few, how we weren't our jobs, we were ourselves for a little while, how for a little while, at least no one could just fly away. And a whole other different group of humans got to see amazing films for the first time ever.
Wow. That's really profound and special and heartening. And probably a great place to wrap up. My answer to your question, Anthony, is we hope so. We definitely talked about when the pandemic happened. Yeah, let's try something new and see if people respond to it. So please tell your your friends who don't watch films as regularly to check it out and see what they think, and try something new. And thank you all so much for letting your films be a part of this series and for participating. This has been a great conversation. It's going to give me fuel, I think, to go for the next couple months here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.
It's great
And,
meeting you all.
Bye.
The films are available to watch for free until the 16th. If you feel like donating, you can also do that at Maysles.org. Thanks, everyone. And good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks again. Good night. Bye.
Bye.